Welcome to the Medic Side Hustles podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Shubhendu Kulshreshtha, an executive coach and emergency physician helping clinicians like you make medicine your side hustle. I author the Impactful Clinician micro newsletter, and I'm the creator of the Clinician Impact Actionship, a program that helps you find your non-clinical zone of impact and take action. In each episode of this podcast, we sit down with an inspiring guest who's redefined their career, turning their strengths and experience into something greater. We'll look into how purpose, equity, and influence come together in their career, focusing on crucial decision-making moments that we can all learn from. In the second half, I tend to hand over the mic to my guest and let them ask me whatever they like about non-clinical careers and coaching. Usually we've got live audience. If anyone's joined us, feel free to drop your questions in the comments or the chat and we'll try and pick them up. We've had a lot of technical issues today, so apologies for that. This is a really unique episode because with me, I've got Wesley Fogel. He's not a clinician. He doesn't work for the NHS. He calls himself the Pitchman. So when I first met Wesley, he was knee-deep working on his health tech startup called On the Mend, wading through all the processes of NHS pilots. Next week, he was headed to raise over $1 million for his startup, and a month later, he was doing it again. So I said, this is going to be a really useful conversation for my audience, and he's agreed to gratefully join me on this podcast today. So Wesley's got a BSc and an MSc in economics. He's worked for big players and job roles that don't really make sense for me, but I know they're of quite importance in the world of finance. And I want to let Wesley explain to us what all of that means. He's now also a fundraising consultant as well as the co-founder of On the Mend. Thank you so much for joining me, Wesley. I'd love to hear more about your journey. And yeah, thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks, Shub. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And I think, as you described that, it's definitely not been a conventional career path, which I think for a startup founder is the best preparation for entering that most of uncertain and unclear paths where you do need to rely on your, I think, adaptability as one, but also knowing what you know and also being clear on what you don't. So having the ability to be humble as well as confident in equal measure. So I think those things have carried me, in pretty good stead, working as a founder of a health tech startup, working with clinical experts, technical experts, commercial, design, others. It's been a fascinating journey, and my career path has definitely helped me to bring something to the table, and that real sort of element of uniqueness has definitely been fundraising, and that's where I think the benefits have spread a little bit more wider than my own startup in the past.
That is amazing. Could you just give us a brief, very high level overview of all of the checkpoints in your career and when the trajectory changed so we can look at it from a big picture perspective?
Sure. Well, I mean, I graduated with economics and I was definitely on the path towards an academic career. So I went straight from my master's to work as a research assistant. Actually, I was lucky enough to go to Cambridge and work there with my undergraduate lecturer, in fact. And being in my early 20s, working towards a PhD, and having never worked in the real world before, I was definitely in two minds. Am I on the right path or not? Just made a very, you could say, impulsive decision to go as far away from that world, both physically and metaphorically as possible. I went to live in Japan without any real plan, to be honest, which in your early 20s can work for or against you, depending on how you play it. And I think it did generally work for me in that I managed to land myself a role as a journalist with Bloomberg News in Tokyo and spent a good few years there, enjoying not just the job of immersing myself in an entirely different region, being exposed to new ideas, new people, culture, learning the language and figuring out a totally different part of the world than where I had come from. And it really made me realize how London and England and the UK is a relatively small part of the global story. And that was 20 plus years ago. I think the story now has become even more apparent on that basis. But having gone to Japan, having tried something new, I was fortunate after that to go to New York, spend some time with a consultancy there, which was more specializing in the research that I had been doing in my academic days in business cycles and in economics. That was more of a marketing role, and still wanting to do more research. I found myself coming back to the UK and came back into a research economist role with another consultancy. And then spent a decade in investment banking, mostly in investment strategy across emerging and frontier markets. So definitely learnt a wholly new set of markets that I wasn't familiar with, from Nigeria to Saudi Arabia to Vietnam, Argentina and others, and became quite sort of adventurous, if you like, in terms of how I analysed investment opportunities and presented those to investors. And again, one of those skills has definitely carried me into a deep dive into the health tech space, because at the end of that career path in finance, I had a knee injury, I had a surgery on my right meniscus and had to have quite a lengthy physiotherapy treatment after that. And actually 2 years later, a slap repair on my shoulder, which had another 18 months of physical rehabilitation. So in all of those instances, just reminded of how sheets of paper, lack of care and support by myself at home, feeling, quite frustrated, lonely, daunting, and all those other emotions, was quite, I had a feeling that I could do something about that and try to help patients and, put together my sort of skills of doing an analysis or a deep dive on an industry like healthcare and seeing where the opportunities were and essentially put together a plan of doing something about it.
Wow. Wow, that is really interesting. So I'm going to try and summarize this. Very, very academic initial start, doing a PhD, went into journalism in Japan, then went into marketing in New York, came back to the UK and got into investment banking, and then took on a lens of looking at opportunities for investments and where the next sort of best investment strategy might work for big banks and big companies. And then you had a personal story that really influenced your career change and influenced you to actually take on the responsibility for making that better. And I think a lot of my listeners might resonate with that because often it's either our personal stories or somebody around us, often our patients. And we have this strong urge to want to make things different and make them better as well. So tell me a bit more about what that journey looked like for you and how did all of your background contribute to where you're.
Yeah, I think the accumulation of skills as you go on a diverse career path as I have, I think you tend to sort of cheat in that sense that you take the best of all those areas. Journalism, I think, is a fundamental, I guess you can call it discipline, but also a skill in terms of being able to communicate an idea to universally to an audience that's much wider than typically the people you would interact with on a daily basis who you meet. You're trying to break something down into easy to digest and understand pieces. And I think that communication aspect, I think, is so core to how you are able to work in life and obviously personally and professionally develop yourself. And I think, I was very lucky. I think Bloomberg is quite a unique place, even though it's a business news organization from a communications and basically the ideas that they were going through that organization, you learn fundamentally quite a lot. I remember the 5 F's being, I'm not going to remember all of them, but things like first, fastest, factual, all these things that try to make the news story immediate and impactful and relevant and interesting to the reader. And I think then taking that idea and into investments, specifically thinking about the principle I was always taught is to investors, you want to surprise, you want to entertain and make the money. And I think the ability to be able to take essentially what's happening in the world around you and turning that into something that is almost like a secret, is not is an unknown element of that story that maybe people are missing and don't quite understand. And it's your ability to discern that and to communicate that idea. I think that is an interesting aspect that I've also picked up on, in that people tend to be moved by trends and what they read in the news, and ultimately that is basically yesterday's story. It's to be able to find tomorrow's story that is the hardest thing to do, and often you find yourself quite lonely in that space trying to essentially break paths down and find new areas of interest, and that's something that I think as well has sort of touched me as an entrepreneur, in that you're trying to see where, as they say, the puck is going, and being able to identify opportunities and trends and see where they are heading. I think it can be a very lonely place. It's by itself, nature, contrarian. It's against the grain. It's different to how people will typically think. And I find, like, if you really push it, the tendency might be for humans to say, it's just not worth it. I'll just revert to mean. I'll just follow the trail that's been laid out in front of me. I'll find a job. I'll do a conventional employment. It's the safest bet. But I think what's become apparent in certainly the last 2 or 3 years is that is the hardest path to take now, because of the way things are changing. So again, that adaptability, but also anticipatory perspective, I think really is important. And those are the things that have really held me in my career path to this point.
Absolutely fascinating. I mean, my initial thoughts were that I think as clinicians we're very risk averse and we're really trying to like hedge a bet on where things might be heading, and we want to be very sort of evidence driven and have had research behind what we're implementing. But at the same time, I kind of put myself in a resus scenario in a resuscitation room in the emergency department, and I said, well, actually, we kind of do that on a daily basis. The moment a patient walks in and we're wondering where things are heading, we're already sort of plotting in our minds what's going to happen next and anticipating the right move. So for me, that seems like the closest translation of what you're saying. But what you've done is at a much larger scale and a lot more external factors. And it's super, super fascinating. Did you ever work alongside medics? Did you ever meet doctors who had gone across into your field?
Well, I think I've been working as a health tech founder since 2017 and have been fortunate to meet a whole raft of people that are essentially either transitioning or have transitioned in their career paths. And I think those individuals are often the most forward thinking and, ability to experiment and try out new ideas. Who, as I say, are essentially the exceptions to the rule, and they look it. And it's quite interesting to see people take that path in life. And I think the word risk actually does evoke quite a sense of, putting it all on red aspect. But I think there is something to be said for, being able to manage risk is an entirely different perspective. And I think that's something when you are able to understand, the risk of doing nothing as one option. And I think that's something typically people won't consider as a factor. They might think that there isn't a risk of doing nothing and continuing in the path that they are in. I believe that in itself does say a lot about an individual's capabilities or willingness to be innovative and try new things and test something that hasn't been, let's say, tested sufficiently. And that's where ideas are born and people are willing to try new things. So I would say, yeah, and obviously COVID slightly shrouded the networking capability of that for like 2 years. In the main, I've been fascinated by people who have come from clinical careers. My wife is a former clinical pharmacist, and I've noticed her creative capacity to think outside the box and unconventionally has been repeated as well from other pharmacists who she's worked with and other colleagues. So I've been intrigued by that particular aspect of the industry. And obviously surgeons, I work with an orthopedic surgeon who also has a diverse career path behind him as well. And I think it is that diversity of thought and of experience which absolutely defines and sets that person apart from what is the crowd.
So if you met a medic, say a surgeon or a GP perhaps with about 10 years of experience or so, who said, oh, I really want to get into the world of finance, maybe get into VC and like help them sort of invest in health tech startups and things like that. Like I enjoy the way money works and I constantly keep track of the stock market and my investments are doing okay. What sort of advice would you have for them?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question because there are in finance a lot of crossover skills and domain knowledge that you find people leverage to enter the finance profession. And I think it's an interesting one where if someone with that level, I think medicine is a specific area because I think the level of training and the depth of experience you gain really lends itself to either being good at that profession or being able to leverage the hell out of it when it gets to crossover to domains like finance. And I think if the person who is considering doing that really understands the consequences and the potential of it, they would, I would say, not hesitate to make that transition. But I think it is, as I say, it's a black and white sort of story there. If they've got the capacity to be innovative, forward thinking and try something new, they are most likely going to do it with or without my advice, essentially. So I think it says a lot about the person's capacity to do what they're saying as opposed to just to talk about it. So I would probably just ask them, how serious are they about doing this? And if they are really serious about it, then they should really just go for it. And if they're hesitating, then it says a lot about what they're really thinking about the opportunity and how they would make the most of it. Because ultimately, it's for them to fall, with that or rise together and see that equally, essentially, as an opportunity to learn and to develop themselves. But it's maybe not as simple as that.
I think that's beautiful. I have a lot of conversations with clinicians who say, I really want this, but I don't know where to start. And I think in our conversation already, we've kind of covered so many transferable skills. We've talked about storytelling, communication, understanding trends, and obviously there's technical aspects behind that, but those are really key skills that you kind of have to practice on both sides of the fence. Talk to me a bit about your own decision making when you were deciding to leave a corporate job and take up this health tech startup. What were your kind of thoughts around then? What were you most scared of? What were you most excited about?
Yeah, well, I think it's more a question of cumulatively experiencing so much uncertainty. My first redundancy actually in finance was in the 2008 financial crisis after Lehman collapsed. And my first real shock redundancy, actually. And I still remember to this day being told to leave and responding, but how can I? I've got so much work to do. That was my naive response. I just didn't understand how someone who's so busy and involved and hopefully thought of as productive in their job could be as a result of just mandatory cost cutting, be told to leave. And so I think that awoke in me the sense that you are forever and a day going to be a cog in a wheel, and the machine will keep running no matter whether you are in that or not. And I think being comfortable with the idea of being expendable is something that is quite humbling, as I say at the start, and being able to have a inner confidence in yourself, knowing that maybe your market value was just too high for the company to be able to cover and afford, because they just don't have the capacity to do that. And I think
Wow.
you see that in finance year in, year out. Restructuring is basically taking an industry that would have been in millions into the hundreds of thousands of people, and ultimately, even lower. And I think that just each individual person that goes through that change, which is forced upon them, it's how they respond and how they adapt that is going to be the defining, kind of way of how that person basically just gets on in life, and sees that this challenge is something that should be seen as an opportunity. And I feel like those attitudes, that thinking, has definitely helped me in the very, very uncertain world in which I operate in, and we all generally operate in today. But as I was just saying, I had a meeting just not long before this call, how in my age and experience now, just knowing that being on the field for long enough leads you to opportunities that will eventually come along. And I think being able to know that there is always going to be something, if you do continue to put your mind and heart and effort and soul into something. I'm a big believer of getting out what you put in, but I think there's a limit to that, and also a limit to understanding of what that really means in terms of the sacrifice, in terms of the opportunity, but also in terms of how that's perceived by your loved ones, how it's perceived by your colleagues and friends and others, who may not understand that and see it from your perspective. So there's a lot about the way you're perceived that's important.
No, thank you for sharing that. I think it's a really interesting point. I think for me and my listeners, I guess traditionally medicine's never been considered a career with, I guess, a risk in terms of redundancy. And I think for the first time in a long time, we are potentially facing that period now. I mean, there's a lot of doctors who are struggling to find a job now, despite years and years of training, multiple PhDs, and deep expertise in their knowledge. And I mean, I'm having conversation with medical students who are worried about getting a job once they train to become a specialized clinician. So I think this is probably the harsh reality that many of us around the world might be facing, especially with the way healthcare is being restructured, with the introduction of AI and technology sort of transforming the way healthcare is delivered for everyone's betterment. But I love the reframe that you had there, that it's a representation of them not being able to afford your market value. And I think as medics, we've never thought about it that way. We've never associated value with ourselves. We've associated value with the role that we play. And what I'm hearing in what you said is also a shift between being defined by your role, but also really owning what your value is. I guess, how would you now define what your real value is? Like, what would people pay you for? What's the change you make in the world? How would you define that?
Yeah, well, I think it's a fascinating question. And I think it is a world of clinical entrepreneurs now, and entrepreneurs that want to enter the clinical sphere. And these worlds are absolutely colliding as we speak. And I think the ability to think of yourself not as a cost center, but as a profit making part of any organization, you should always be thinking about how can you improve, firstly, the profitability, but also the efficiency and the improvement of outcomes of everything that you are doing, because you are going to be evaluated by an accounting department who is going to see you relative to an estimated or industry average that you will essentially be justifying your existence against. And I think that's something for most people to see and think about is maybe even unpleasant, because if you think of it in the purest sense, what healthcare is about is improving the quality of life or extending that life. But actually, in a sense, all it really is an accounting process, trying to justify the cost of something against the benefit. I would, having come from a finance background where I just lived in spreadsheets and see a hospital just like any other organization as a living, breathing spreadsheet of data. Everything has its limit, and I think we are getting close to that point where the capacity, the affordability of how things currently operate is just being pressed to the limit. And I think there is a point at which that has to be at the moment of truth, or the ultimate point where we have to change how we do things is coming fast. And that means that people have to think on their feet and adapt to that change.
Yeah. So how do you take that? How do you take your ability to look at everything as a spreadsheet, I guess, and its profits and losses and the balance in the system? How do you take that and convert that into your role as the fundraising consultant when people come to you?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting one as well because, and I believe another very senior experienced VC talked about transitioning from a PowerPoint startup to a spreadsheet startup. And the PowerPoint startup is the one that talks about the vision, the idea, the problem, the solution, the team, everything that you typically see in a pitch deck. And that does carry you forward to the point where you can take product to market. And as I was recently talking about on a post, that even in this very driven AI driven world, that kind of earlier stage now is being compressed and accelerated even more, to the point where you almost need to think of yourself as a spreadsheet business from day one and think about what is the mechanics and the economics of how this business operates. How much money do I really need to move this business to the next level, to achieve a key performance indicator, a KPI, and ultimately just justify or generate a return on investment that can qualify you for investment at that earlier stage.
Mm.
I think, again, the ability to think in those terms, it's just another one of those competencies which I think you need to bring to the table. And either you embody it in yourself because you have a financial analyst mind or think in those spreadsheet terms, or you bring the PowerPoint perspective, which can inform the spreadsheet mind, but you still need, to some extent, both of those skills to essentially convince or put across compellingly the argument that says this is a business that's worth backing, and as well as the people and the technology that you're developing. So those are quite complementary skills, but do require equal
Yeah.
strengths. Yeah.
That's beautiful. I think for a lot of clinicians, money is a bit of an icky thing to talk about, and I think like converting healthcare into profits and losses is something that often people find goes against their values, quote unquote, because they don't want to productize it. They don't want it to turn into a KPI because there's a human at the end of it. But you're right. Like if you are running a business, I mean, you're running a service that helps people, and you need the money to try and keep that going. Money is what kind of will run the engine. And if there isn't any flow of money in that system, then you're not going to be able to do that for very long. Neither will you have support and backing to scale that project. So I love the perspective of the presentation startup versus the spreadsheet startup. Do you often work with clinicians in this space, and what's your biggest challenge or what common challenges do you see when it comes to clinicians?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with a lot of clinicians. Obviously, time is the main constraint because they do have so much to do on a daily basis, and also, like I've said before, in terms of the willingness to be forward thinking and innovative and change how things have always been done. I think there is definitely going to be an inbuilt resistance mechanism there. But the ones that I have worked with, as I say, in the main are very innovative, very forward thinking, and collaborative. And I think that gives them the kind of inner strength to go on, and to obviously look at themselves in both positive and negative, see their strengths and see their weaknesses, and understand where they need help. And I think the ones that have really dug in and done the work, they engage with content that I share with them. They go away and you can see they do their homework on a weekly basis. They are the ones who tend to have more chance of success and kind of willingness to kind of follow through. Yeah, I think it's just an interesting area to kind of enter when it comes to healthcare. You mentioned the word service, and I think the idea of it being a public service in the UK and a private one in overseas markets. And I obviously work with entrepreneurs all over the world, and it is interesting when you see an industry like healthcare seen from both public and private sector, how differently they can be seen, when at the bottom line, it's still a human being's healthcare that you're trying to provide and the outcomes you're trying to lead to. So it's fascinating to think about how, thinking of healthcare, even in the public sector, where they have got chief financial officers and accounting departments and people doing bean counting, you've got to think of these organizations in the same way. But we know, I think everyone on this call from an NHS perspective who's been on the ground will know that they are absolutely not operating in those ways, but they just need to. And I think the people that see that on the ground are those contrarian thinkers and are the ones who are willing to take on the fight. And those are the people I tend to speak to.
Wow. So I guess let's try and get a bit more specific to give even more value to our listeners here, right? Can you sort of take us through the various stages, like what's a good time to invest and what are the various stages of investment? What's a pitch deck? And feel free to maybe use your startup On the Mend as an example for this.
Yeah, well, the answer to when is the right time to invest is when you don't have to ask that question, because when you know it's ready, it's ready. And I think that is the inevitability question that needs to be answered. Is this inevitably going to happen with or without investment? And I think
Right.
you really have to be strong against that question. And I think immediately 9 out of 10 get dropped at that one straight away.
Wow.
They don't understand inevitability enough. They think that there's something that might be possible if they get investment, and if, and if, and if. There's no ifs, no buts. This has to happen. You have to believe it, and you have to see and have that vision so clearly that when you have a conversation with someone, they just buy into your vision and just want to help you, want to get behind you. And it's interesting, when I've spoken to and raised investment for my own business, I think 9 out of 10 times the people I speak to, and don't forget, these could be angel investors and high net worths. They've had successful entrepreneurial careers behind them, or are successful entrepreneurs now. They have had an experience, in our case with On the Mend, it's in physical rehabilitation. They've been through the journey. They know how broken the system is, how frustrating the experience is for patients, and how much potential there is for change and improvement. And that I could be that person, could be, of course. And I think hopefully the word inevitable fits there somewhere. But, and the change maker, or the person to bring about that change. And if you can be supported to that point, we all know that startups have a high failure rate for so many reasons. And I think that's where maybe the inevitability point could seem inherently contradictory to someone who does get into that analysis paralysis, overanalyzes. But if it's so unpredictable, how can it be inevitable? No. That's totally an easy answer to the question, but unfortunately it's not sufficient. And you've just got to have that sort of natural flair and capacity to say, no, this is inevitable. And something that keeps you up every night and gets you up in the morning with the same belief, I think that's hard, if I'm honest. But that's where I can tell when I speak to a founder whether they're going to make it or not. It's pretty easy to discern that.
So when the mission and vision come together on the slideshow, and then the profit and loss and the KPIs come together on the spreadsheet, and it becomes inevitable, like it's going to happen, to almost present it as an opportunity for the fundraiser rather than asking for their help, of saying, please believe in me. So it's an opportunity for them, is the point at which you should go ahead and get some fundraising. Is that?
Yeah. Well, I've asked many fund managers, investors, what was it that made the pitch deck happen? So all the things that were outlined on the vision, how did it happen? Was it money? Was it luck? Was it timing? Was it something else? And the answer I get more often than not was, it's the team. It's the founder and the team. And I kind of pull my hair out thinking, what are you talking about? That doesn't tell me anything. But it's only after so many years of walking the path as a founder, I realized what they mean and how that inevitability becomes self-fulfilling. And it's just so difficult. And that's why a lot of talk is around the average age of successful founders is in their 50s. Second-time founders are backable because of the experience and all the rest of it. And I think there's a lot to be said for knowing what you're doing and why you're doing it, how you're going to do it, plotting out that path. It's just one of those things. And I think the best thing that medics and others who want to enter this space can do is latch onto someone who's walked the path, or is walking the path and having some element of success to it, wants to contribute something, advise or support, learn from that. If it fails or succeeds, you will learn nonetheless. And you just need to carry that experience forward and figure out what is it that made a company succeed or not from the point of view of the founding team. And that is your secret, weapon, as it were, because most people will struggle to understand how these TechCrunch articles are written with 10, 20, 100 million rounds by people who you wouldn't think are backable or is an idea that is credible or investable. It's so intangible, not specified at the point to make you understand. You can only understand by working directly with those people or understand the process they follow to get to that stage.
For some of the listeners who might not know what a pitch deck is, can you just quickly tell them what that is?
Yeah, it's a teaser. So it should be something that gives people a kind of entices people to see the opportunity that you've identified. So you really want to, at the first page of this pitch deck, explain what exactly is the scale of this problem, this pain, or even potential gain, but typically pain, and then understand how it is that you uniquely, really uniquely, can solve it. And so your outline of the value proposition, and then how you're going to take it to market, how you're going to get paid, are there any competitors, what's the projections, how are you going to market this, and how much do you need to get to the next stage. If you can outline that in a clearly kind of thoughtful and provoking and interesting and entertaining way that shows people how they'll make money, you've got your answer to the question. I think, again, 9 out of 10 might struggle with it because they do need to have a capability that carries them through every single page, not just as a presentation, but as something to realize, to make happen. And that, again, becomes very self-fulfilling, and you need to have people follow you on that journey.
How much of this needs to be sort of prototyped to actually tangible with maybe a pilot test or something of that sort? And how much of this needs to be a projection of like, this is the idea and it's a reasonable idea because...
Yeah, that's a classic analysis by paralysis kind of question, because you can analyze something to the nth degree and never answer that question sufficiently. The only way to really answer it is by giving an outcome to a payer, to a customer, for which they are willing to pay you. So you might say a pilot, a free pilot, or some kind of project, as long as that is tied to KPIs that matter to the payer, that can then be delivered on a reasonable time frame. You should be able to deliver that at cost if you can, if you're being generous as a free pilot. But I think the ultimate objective here is to understand value, not just about doing something for free. So if you are able to commit to delivering a project and for that purpose, showing value to the payer, then you'll be able to not only showcase value for your customer, but also then at the end of that demonstration or proof of concept, be able to secure your first revenues. And that should be as simple as that, really. And so what is it you need to get that revenue on the board? I think that is essentially your first question to address. And as long as that's a scalable customer revenue opportunity, then you have your first element of your pitch.
And how about even before that? So someone's got an idea for an app, for example. I guess that's one of the most common ones. And they need a developer, and it's going to cost them a couple of £1,000s to build that app. What's the best place for them to try and get that money?
Yeah, it's a typical question. And obviously, when it comes to relatively low cost, the first place that people should look to is themselves. So directors' loans are the most common and should be seen as the best way to show to people that you really believe in what you are doing, and also that you're conscious about cost control. So it's not that you're asking yourself to put in an inordinate amount of money, but any type of business does cost some money, whether it's from advisors to help guide you on how you utilize that funding, or whether it's the funding that you put in yourself. You do need to think about yourself as the first funder of your business. And if you're willing to put something or anything in, and then ask others to match it, perhaps, it could be colleagues, it could be a consortium. And I think the industry that people work in, healthcare, is a mine to go down, because you could ultimately find so many potential not just investors, but partners as well, and users and others. You should be able to find that you're in the middle of a gold mine, essentially, where you've got all that opportunity. You don't realize it because it's essentially not part of the daily grind or the remit of your job. But actually, you should think of yourself as, in the best way I kind of think of, when I worked in an investment bank, people who worked in finance as an industry, a lot of those people have transitioned to entrepreneurship and maybe feel very comfortable doing that. I've sought investment from colleagues at the scale, which as an angel investor is probably more typical. But I think when you're really trying to think of a business idea at the core, at the start, very, very start, then ultimately you could think of colleagues and yourself as the funders. Of course, friends and family are, beyond the colleagues and industry people as well, potential people to ask and approach, partly because you're committed to something. They also know you. They could understand your capacity and understanding of the problem you're going after. And so all this is credibility building, and building on that established understanding of the people in your circle of influence. And gradually, I think the tools of social media make it so much so that if you really do believe in this and feel passionate about it, and the word passion, I think, is always a careful one to think about, but it's essentially it's unbounded interest, right? But unbounded is a dangerous word in some senses. But you feel very strong about an idea and you want to go after it. Write about it, put it into words, write a few sentences or a regular posting stream. When you see something in the news, when you see someone doing something, or you've experienced something, just share it. And the more you share, the more people will want to follow you and to get behind what you do. And then ultimately your message to people that you might want to do something like a crowdfunding campaign where people can input small amounts of money to help support your early target. People do GoFundMe campaigns for various reasons. This could be another one where as an impact investment, it could be seen in that light. So those are my first sort of initial thoughts when you're trying to fund an early stage. But ultimately, these should be low cost, very close connections, and ultimately even at some point zero cost, because you might want to do some reconnaissance work. So, put out what's called a smoke test. So on your website, have a link to sign up for your product, but actually is just a wait list in disguise. But actually, you're trying to gauge, like, do people actually think of this as something they want to try out? So smoke tests can be quite powerful. Again, proof of concept to be able to show to people who
Yeah.
want to put real money
And
into
for
it.
yourself, I guess, to see what is the market signaling back, where should you actually invest your time and energy. And as you were saying that, I was remembering in my early days as well that there were, I mean, as a service business, it's traditionally a zero cost startup in a way, because I don't have capital that I have to buy. But there was things that I invested in my own training, the time I put in to learn new skills. And then eventually when I decided to scale down my clinical time, I took a pay cut, and in a way I saw that as an investment I was putting in myself of that amount to be able to buy back my time to do more of this. And I think that's a really beautiful perspective shift you've provided as well. Now, I know you've got an online course. Does that sort of cover some of these elements?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've worked with founders on their fundraising challenges in terms of how to build the collateral. So, yeah, having a strong pitch deck, like we talked about, a website which can have material that's consistent with that messaging, a narrative on social media that you continue to develop, and then ultimately find channels of fundraising that you can go down. I've talked about crowdfunding, there's grant funding as well, obviously angels, venture capital, accelerator models, there's networking platforms, and various other ways that I've used in the past, and obviously would recommend founders to follow as they go on their journey. And I did create this course basically as a sort of reverse engineering of the time I spent working with individual founders and seeing how what I was advising was helping them on their journeys, and just put this into something that's more structured and they could follow in a good sort of less than 2 hours on video, and then ultimately just use this resources document to plot out all the plans that they need to implement, essentially, and put together as a strategy for fundraising. Because as I say, you need to have this kind of structure, this inevitability, this confidence, and knowing what you're doing, knowing what works, learning from the experiences of others. All those things are so important. And yeah, I find that's something that's been helpful to people I've worked with, and I put it in a course for people to watch.
Yeah, that's amazing. So I guess we'll leave links to that in the description and the comments. And I guess if people have questions, they can probably reach out to you on LinkedIn. Is that the best place?
Yeah, they can do that. wesleyfogel.com, and yeah, watch me on LinkedIn. And I think, yeah, if anyone has any questions, just reach out. There's a 30-minute call we can have as an intro, and I'd love to hear more about what you're thinking and how I could help.
Amazing. On that note, I think I should also let people know that my Clinician Impact Actionship is now open for applications as well. It's a 6-week program designed for clinicians who want to take back control of their careers, build credibility beyond just their clinical work, and establish themselves as either leaders, innovators, or entrepreneurs. So putting in that inner work to figure out where is it that they're actually heading next. So yeah, if anyone's ready to break out of their clinical role and create new opportunities without walking away from medicine entirely, then head over to my website, www.coachwithshub.com/action for a few more details. I'm not going to take too much more of your time, Wesley, but I do want to give you the next 5 to 10 minutes to ask me any particular questions that you might have for me.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear. You obviously have gone through a change in your career path, and what really you found surprised you most so far about that transition? What has been the unexpected part of that story?
That's a good question. Let me take a quick second to think about it. I mean, there were so many different unexpected bits, but if I'm looking at the whole journey and the transition, perhaps something that I knew and was expecting but was still unexpected was the degree of uncertainty on this journey, on the startup business entrepreneur journey, and the weird sense of loneliness. Like, you feel like you're kind of surrounded by a lot of people, you've got a lot of support, but then you're kind of still on this journey on your own, because really the ideas that you have are in your mind. And I think the whole thing is about translating those ideas and that vision and that belief into something that other people can also materialize and hold on to and join in. And I think looking back, for me, that kind of contributes to this element of, I guess, loneliness, and then the struggle to, like, the uncertainty of, hey, if I say this, are people going to actually understand what I'm saying? And at the same time, am I serving them in the best way that I want to serve them? And how do I do that? I guess the whole reason I got into coaching was also kind of the same thing. Like, for many, many years, I'd thought about wanting to help people in their ideas and making change stick and making change happen. And there was just this gradual realization that, giving advice or telling people what to do isn't really what works. And when I came across the world of coaching and coaching methodology, for me, that suddenly became like a skill set that could unlock what I could see in them that they couldn't see in themselves, and I was able to suddenly translate into action and change that actually stuck. So working with clinicians helps me make that happen for a wider healthcare system. But yeah, the uncertainty, I think.
Well, that's the loneliness. I totally relate to that. I mean, I wondered if has anything changed about how you perceive healthcare professionals, clinicians now, from the perspective how you see them, from how you thought about them in the past.
Oh yeah, big time. I think, and then commented on Stuart's post the other day on LinkedIn about this as well. I think we're in such a big bubble. The whole concept of value is kind of lost within at least the NHS or the healthcare system in general. We often see ourselves as ranks and our roles and what we kind of do to contribute to the patient care. But, translating that into what it truly means in the wider context of the world for the patient, for the healthcare system, for the hospital, what value does it generate? And I mean both monetary as well as non-monetary value. And realizing that we don't actually get a piece of any of it, like there's no form of equity that stays with us apart from perhaps a little bit of reputation and credibility in very senior years. And I think it angers me a lot to see that often that's being taken advantage of to try and optimize the system and make it more efficient. Is things like professionals having to pay for their own parking, lunches being charged up, just the way your payroll is sort of calculated. I mean, we get paid the same hours for weekend day shifts and weekend or any night shift, I guess. And that just is like an entire... So let me give you more details. So as an emergency clinician, I get paid for working on a Sunday in the daytime, perhaps in the morning when the department's not as busy and there's lots of other people around, lots of consultants and specialties. And I get paid the same to be leading the same department on a night shift when it could be really, really busy. So there's no correlation between the work you do, the value you create, and what you get paid or remunerated for. And I think that shift has just been mind-boggling. And I'm just like, I feel like shouting at people and saying, don't you realize? Don't you realize? Yeah.
That's hard. And I guess the question then inevitably is what can be done to address that?
Yeah, I think there's beyond just what can be done is to start realizing what's already happening. I think the way doctors are positioned in the healthcare system by the people who run the system is changing. So where you used to put the doctor and what you would expect out of them and the value that they would generate would be different from what it's now and what it's going to be in the future. And I think introduction of allied health professionals, PAs, and other roles into that system is sort of similar. So I guess an example was I had this weird thought in my head when I was doing anesthetics. You currently have a 1:1 relationship between the patient and the anesthetist, and that the anesthetist sits with the patient through the whole surgery, through the whole anesthetic time, because that's the degree of caution and care that's required. And I, for some reason, could imagine a time when technology became good enough that you wouldn't need the human sitting there the whole time, and perhaps a point where one anesthetist could be running 10 theaters, remotely monitoring from a central control room, for example. I mean, that doesn't seem like a very far-fetched thought, especially now, and perhaps they won't even need to be there in person because they might have another anesthetic associate who's not a doctor, but perhaps is another adequately trained person for that role, delivering the actual contact between the patient and a human being. So I think there are these trends which are already taking place and we are completely blinded to them. I think we're still stuck in thinking that our expertise is what will make us valuable in the long run, but it's a different sort of expertise that will be valuable 10 years down the line.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, having worked 7 years now for On the Mend, I wondered what is it that changes the pace at which change happens from dog years to human years? We have to wait 7 years for 1 year worth of change. What is it that can move the needle on that?
Yeah, I think it's a realization of where we're heading and where we want to head. If everybody can align on that, then we can really collate all the efforts to make that happen. I think it's a big mission within the medical community to try and speed up the change we see from research. So traditionally it takes at least 10 years from a new research to change practice. So even if a really well-validated research with adequate numbers suggests a change in current practice, traditionally takes about 10 years to actually bring that into effect. And there's a huge movement to try and shorten that time by raising awareness, talking about what are all the factors leading into it, building new guidelines, and sort of disseminating that information. And really what I took away was, okay, you just need everyone to align, be aware of what the goal is, where we're heading, why we're heading that way, and how do we get there. So yeah, it's extremely tricky just by the nature of how big it is.
Sounds like a lot of work ahead for us both, I'm sure. Okay, interesting. Very interesting. No, thanks for answering those questions.
No, thank you for asking them. They were really, really insightful. Yeah. So thank you so much for being on here, Wesley. This, I think, was a very insightful conversation, at least for me, and I'm sure it was for my audience as well. So thank you to our audience for tuning into the Medic Side Hustle podcast. Our next live podcast will be on the 9th of April, where we've got two scheduled speakers. We've got Dr. Suman Paul talking about personal finance, and Dr. Ola Vanstein, who doesn't really need any introductions, and I'm assuming that most of you know her already. If you're wondering whether you're ready to make medicine your side hustle, try my 3-minute quiz that's in the comments. Wesley, any lasting comments or call to action for our listeners?
Well, I think the one big one is to not think, but just do. Don't overanalyze, and do reach out for help if you need it.
So I hope this conversation sparked some ideas and inspired you to think bigger about your career and your impact. Until next time, stay curious, keep solving big problems, and remember, you have the power to create something extraordinary. See you soon.